Welcome to a new episode of Becoming a Post-Growth Planner, Obstacles and Challenges to Changing Roles and Practices. And today in this episode, we move a bit south and we have Angelos with us.
Yes, Christian, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here, be part of this podcast series that I'm following. I'm Angelos Varvarousis. I am urban planner and a senior researcher at ICTA UABM. I'm also a member of the research collective Research and Degrowth, which is like a major academic association from more or less the beginning of the degrowth scholarship movement. I am since 2013 there. And finally, I'm also co-director of the master program Degrowth, Ecology, Economics and Policy, which is one of the two programs here at the Autonomous University of Barcelona that we are offering relating to degrowth.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm Lamker, University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and they are working as assistant professor for sustainable transformation and regional planning. And it's my very pleasure to talk to you today, especially because you have been involved in a special issue in urban studies earlier this year titled Urbanizing Degrowth Towards a Radical Spatial Degrowth Agenda for Our Cities. Can you briefly explain what brought you together as an editorial team of 4 colleagues to set up and also to collect for such a special issue that is deeply needed?
Yes, the special issue was published this May, like a few months ago. And, all of us, we have been working on degrowth or on urban planning or the intersections of them for many years. I mean, we are talking for a group with some amazing scholars with many and different complementary skills. Like, for instance, Maria Kaika is a leading scholar, basically, in urban political ecology, like one of the people that first highlighted the materiality of urbanization in a way, and the making of urban natures. Or Hugh March, who is an expert in urban sustainability discourses, a critical analyst of the smart cities, and he has also worked on degrowth previously. Federico de Maria, who is one of the more prominent, most cited degrowth scholars, also a co-editor of the Geographies of Degrowth, and myself, that I have been working on degrowth since 2008. And I had also written much earlier in 2018 a paper for the Oslo Triennale on degrowth called Degrowth in the City, in which I tried perhaps one of the first attempts to lay out a concrete degrowth agenda. So when we came together in 2019 to pursue this effort for the special issue, there was very little on the intersections of urban studies and degrowth, and even less. And I mean, there were some discussions, let's say, but if I may, they were a little bit formalistic in a way, these discussions. So they were discussing mostly what is the better shape for degrowth, what is if there was a discussion between urban planners and degrowthers, mainly debating on this issue. Like, urban planners were accusing degrowth for being very simplistic and that they are only about small scale experiments and they don't deal very soon, which was true. And even less was what was written on issues of urbanization. So we started this project with the aim to derail a little bit from this discussion on the urban form, or the spatial form that's suitable for degrowth, and then into how we can create transformative processes, let's say, for going from today towards the degrowth society. So that was more or less what inspired this work.
Yeah, what I find great that you really set up a 5-step agenda towards also connecting urban studies to spatial sciences, particular spatial planning in the editorial to the special issue. And you also argue for a crucial need to engage with planning institutions and also the professionals working in them, their daily practices. From your impression, why have the links to spatial planning so far still been little explored?
Yes, first of all, we must acknowledge that an incipient field and an incipient, let's say, scientific scholarship cannot include everything in its first steps. And we must also acknowledge that nowadays, the degrowth scholarship has advanced a lot in the field of spatial planning, urban planning, and what I want to call, like, more broadly, degrowth spatial politics have been developed substantially in the last 4 or 5 years. Degrowth started mainly from the field of development studies and economics. There were very few geographers, very few urban planners in the original community, let's say. The first discussions on the topic started only in 2015, like the very initial discussions. Of course, the growers always knew that they need some sort of spatial thinking for degrowth, and they were employing, like, let's say, images. Let's say the counter image to the polluting city, in a way, the counter image of the eco-village, or the counter image of, like, the older Mediterranean city full of conviviality. The degrowth scholarship was always interested and inspired by these small-scale experiments, and they were trying to analyze them. And that was the point of debate, basically, with the first urban planners that dealt with degrowth in, like, 2015. Jean Jouet, first of all, and then, like, more urban planners. So the main point of discussion, the main point of debate was that the degrowth literature is so much about small-scale experiments, small-scale ventures, and they don't pay attention to bigger scales, to, like, planning institutions that basically shape the space production. That was the debate.
Yeah, in all these search over the last, especially couple of years, the terms degrowth and post-growth are often used together, partly in overlapping ways or in distinction to each other. In your editorial, you also name post-growth for a more distant future, a paradigm, a form of urbanization maybe. But how would you see the connection or differences between degrowth and post-growth as terms?
It's important, I think, first of all, to understand that post-growth signifies the future in all its plurality, hopefully diversity, sustainability, and this plurality, diversity, and sustainability that should happen by design and not by disaster. And I mean, this is how we use the growth. We use the growth in order to signify this plural, diverse, and sustainable future. But it is important at the same moment to understand and to realize and to insist that this future cannot come without phasing out the well-oiled growth machine. And this necessarily entails shrinkage, degrowth, in both quantitative and qualitative terms, which, of course, is not like a universal homogeneous process to all sectors. Because we understand that the problem here is also capitalism. Capitalism is fundamentally undemocratic, which means that basically that what will happen with the surplus is decided by very few. And so what we say is that this degrowth planning in more general, not only degrowth urban planning, degrowth planning in more general, is like the democratic and organized discussion about what to increase and what to decrease. But knowing, of course, that the overall volume of the production and consumption should reduce somehow.
Angelos, in degrowth debates, there has always been a lot of talk about small-scale alternatives niche practices, developments that often happen to be completely or more or less distinct from institutional practices of spatial planning, especially at higher scales. And they were also often detached from spatial planning as well. Why is that important then also that degrowth scholarship especially also tries to reconnect to spatial planning, to institutional practices, and also aims to understand and to feed into the way how basically spatial planners work in their practices very much to the ground at different levels?
First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that any nascent literature, any nascent discipline or like scientific field cannot start with dealing with everything. So it's true that due to the fact that degrowth started from economists, was first developed by economists, ecological economists, environmental economists, within the field of development studies, let's say perhaps a bit of political science, but there were no geographers or urban planners in the initial cohort of scientists and academics that started to talk about degrowth. And this is why the initial degrowth literature, the first degrowth literature, did not deal with planning institutions, with planning mechanisms, because they knew, of course, that any such big and deep and radical transformation needs some sort of spatiality to be expressed and will produce new spatialities, but they didn't have the tools to approach what these spatialities should look like or how they can come true. So they resorted, let's say, to what like most of the people resort when they try to think our polluting urbanized world differently. And this is why they resorted to schemes like urban villages, eco-villages, the Mediterranean city, and so far and so on. Of course, when the degrowth literature comes to AIDS, and then we understand that the issue of transformation, like the process of transformation, is much more complicated, much more multi-layered. There was a series of attempts in different scientific fields coming from the field of technology. So we had, like in 2018, a special issue on degrowth and technology or marine studies, this so-called blue degrowth. And there was the point, like around 2018, 2019, when a new bands of degrowth urban planners or urban planners, degrowthers, you can set on like wherever you want, but started to embrace and try to link degrowth agendas with spatial planning agendas. And they try to move beyond, let's say, inspiring examples that somehow exemplify degrowth and try to delve deeply into the mechanisms that basically bind spatial production, urban development to growth, and subsequently to try to see how these planning institutions can change, how the growth can inform, can inspire like a new approach in the planning mechanisms.
I think we there touch upon a major problem potentially to integrate more post-growth and degrowth into planning institutions and practices at several scales. Your spatial planning often seeks to find, develop, support positive future directions, which is often only seen as connected to growth that can then be used to finance something else, to do something good with that. While degrowth also puts to clear emergencies, you mentioned by design, not by disasters, so to really avoid disasters, to also put environmental aspects much more central. This at first does not sound too much attractive to planners who are institutionalized in a pro-growth environment. How would you then maybe sell the idea of degrowth to planners who want to build positive futures, but also recognize that it's just not possible in the current pro-growth environment?
I think this is a very interesting question, and it has, I think, two different directions to answer. The one is to further analyze a little bit of what you are calling like these push factors, because it is not only about climate emergency, obviously. There are many push factors for degrowth and for urban degrowth, for degrowth in urban planning. Of course, on the one hand is the climate emergency, and the ecological collapse, let's say, in more generally speaking, that we must be very frank and speak the truth there. And on the other hand is that there is this fallacy of green growth agendas, eco-modernist agendas, that are failing to bring about ecological and social benefits to the urban populations and the world more generally. So this is also another push factor that we must analyze. Why, for instance, the most innovative regions in the field of green growth in Europe remain the most polluting regions in the same area? Or like why a series of green solutions in the urban infrastructure basically is translating into cost shifting towards the global south, or like things like this. So there are many pushing factors, let's say, beyond climate emergency. But if we want to frame like a more positive idea, a more positive framing about why degrowth planning can be good for our societies, I think that we can see a city which can become better, of course, through a convivial sharing of the commons, and this will also extend beyond its perimeter. Because a degrowth city means also less operational landscapes in rural areas, means less extractive geopolitical conflicts and tensions, means like a flourishing of plural forms of frugal abundance, full of joy, full of meaning. So, I mean, it leaves a lot of room for positive ideas to come up and reshape our world.
Yeah, so there are indeed many positive positive futures, positive avenues to take in that way. But you also recognize that the road remains a bit bumpy to get there, with also developments that are yet to be evaluated. And in your editorial, you also warn against watered down versions of degrowth. So versions of degrowth that might have the risk of cooptation, of a continued greenwashing, as we see that the term degrowth and also post-growth becomes more used. There are some tensions involved in how far can it remain its core essence, its core direction. Would you have an advice to both integrate the ideas into decision-making, into spatial planning, institutional activities, but also be aware of the danger that it's not about using the term, but about really changing roles and practices, as also our podcast is titled?
Yes, I think this like also has two different parts. The question, the first is like why the growth is becoming more a little bit like sort of attractive, and how can avoid cooptation. And the second part is like how the growth can, what should we do in a way. So first of all, I must say that at least for me, degrowth is becoming attractive, and I think that it will become more attractive in the future because it's the only political idea and strategy that is fundamentally realistic, meaning here that it acknowledges all the difficulties, all the problems, all the deadlocks, all the impasses of the current developmental pathway in all its plurality, and yet suggest a positive and radical way out of it, out of this misery, out of this catastrophe. And it does it without resorting on claustrophobic schemes of nationalism, closeness, etc. So I think this is like a very important dimension of the degrowth literature in general that makes it fundamentally radical, fundamentally like one of the few, if not the only, progressive pathway towards resolving like our problems here. So for me, and this is the very reason that we insist on using degrowth and not post-growth in general, is that we see these two dimensions, the positive dimension and the realistic dimension, I'm not saying negative, the realistic dimension as being indispensable to degrowth. And this is why we are insisting, because we think that it is not impossible, but it is difficult for degrowth to be co-opted, because it goes against like the very foundation of foundational pillar of the society, which is like the hunting and oiling the growth machine.
Now, what are then the crucial steps to follow up upon and to further ensure that degrowth becomes more used, institutionalized, and also followed either in research and practice, or might be also in education as well?
Yes, I think that what is important to understand degrowth, and especially degrowth in planning, as a very plural, a very multi-layered process that involves a different approach to planning. Let's say avoiding universal solutions without, of course, ending up in some sort of parochial like relativism, of course. So we need to think in different layers. We cannot reduce degrowth, let's say, in a series of planning institutions here and there. We must think degrowth as a new strategy for spatial planning that democratizes planning mechanisms, institutions, embraces plurality by avoiding universalism, fosters autonomy and cooperation across scales and geographies, phases out growth dependency, works towards sustainable, equitable, and convivial production of space, changes the very ideology of the planning mechanism, starts from some grounded versions of where we are now, for instance, and this is a work that we are doing in parallel with this planning research. We're doing a research that is called real existing degrowth, and we try to do some reverse engineering, which means we start to see how people in different geographies have managed historically to secure a satisfactory well-being without being dependent on growth. And from this particular research and from this particular standpoint, we are trying to see what are the mechanisms that can derail somehow, the oil machine, growth machine in these places, and substitute it with something different, with something like post-growth planning. How can we foster more citizens that are compatible with the places that we study, and this is also like the north-south dimension that we bring it's a very important element in our special issue. This is also like the acknowledgement that there is not only one south, there are many souths within the north and many not so souths like within the global south, and we're trying to understand like how all these differences can be articulated in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I agree that the degrowth is quite strong in critically assessing also north-south differences and also ways of exploitative relationships, of often unseen relationships, also in connection to political ecology, in much research that is happening there. But often it's quite challenging to connect that to institutional practices, institutional roles that are taken here. So do you have advice why it's so important to really be open toward both north-south differences and maybe also the different variants of living without growth that are happening all around the globe?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that there have been related fields to degrowth that have long worked with these global north, global south differences from different angles. Let's say the urban political ecology. Maria Kaika and Eric Zwingindau and others have already pointed in these materialities, let's say, of the urbanization of in the global north and the global south, and how the one affects the others, even like since 2004, 2005, like the urban political ecology field has long mentioned these things. So environmental justice scholarship has tried to focus on the global south and see how social movements in the global south basically create a new type of environmentalism that is the so-called environmentalism of the poor, and how this movement can relate to degrowth, etc. But I think that in the degrowth literature so far, this has not been tackled enough. And I think, again, this has a lot to do with this formalistic understanding of the degrowth spatiality that that resorts to a universal idea about the city. So the city is like one universal entity. So the degrowth city is another universal entity. And then there are no discussion. But when you focus on urbanization processes instead, then the whole picture changes, because then you understand how different factors shape urbanization in the global south and in the global north. And how even, which is also important to understand, how a degrowth agenda for cities in the global north can affect cities in the global south, which is also something important. All these things are things, of course, that need a lot of discussion, a lot more research, but are what we call the elephant in the room. And we try to open this discussion in our special issue.
What would you say are major contributions of that special issue in that regard, to give our listeners just a short idea of what angles have been tackled in that special issue?
I think we can have like one or two core contributions of the special issue as a whole, and then many more flagship contributions in each of its articles. But I would say one of the most important things is that we tried to reframe the discussion on the basis of urbanization, and not on the basis of what is a degrowth city, what is a degrowth spatiality. So we are moving from, let's say, from ontology, the ontology of let's say, degrowth in spatial planning, towards a more processual understanding of these things. And this is why we came up with this idea of the 5 steps, which means like going from the spatial image towards spatial processes. So these 5 steps, I think is like a very good starting point for the discussion to go ahead, to move ahead. And now, for instance, I'm working with some colleagues on delving deeper into the second step, which is like the planning institutions. What binds planning to growth, and how can we reframe this whole process? The second, I think, core contribution, which I think is important, is this particular attention to the global north and global south. And there are also papers in the special issue, for instance, Sindler's paper, which says that when we're talking about degrowth planning, degrowth cities in the global south, he frames it as a subordinate degrowth, and says like it will have different characteristics than the ones that we are envisaging for the north, by also pointing out that there are countries that do not easily fit in this polarized dichotomy between the global north and the global south. They work, Sindler et al., they work with Argentina, for instance, which is clearly a country that does not easily fit in these categories. Or we have other papers that trying to understand how cities in the global south have been historically shaped by colonial mechanisms, colonial planning mechanisms. And they try to understand how grassroots actions in the cities basically decolonize in practice this let's say, forceful planning, forceful colonial planning. So I think that the reader can have numerous insights by going through the whole special issue.
So there are many great reasons for planners, spatial planners, to read into the special issue, also read the editorial, also see that 2 of the 5 steps are engaging planning institutions, engaging also insurgent professionals within planning, let's say. And to support that a bit, you know that this podcast uses the term post-growth planning, basically from early on. Therefore, before we finish, as a final summarizing statement, I would like you to contribute to the search for a definition of that within the spatial planning discipline, and to finish the sentence, post-growth planning is.
Okay, I think there are fragments of this, of my understanding of post-growth planning in all our previous discussion. But I would say that if I want to insist on something, that would be that post-growth planning is a whole new approach to spatial planning that democratizes planning mechanisms and institutions towards a sustainable, equitable, and convivial production of space.
Thanks, Angelos, for joining us today in this podcast episode and for sharing all your long-standing international experience on degrowth, institutions, spatial planning, and also giving insights into your most recent special issue in urban studies.
Thank you, Christian. It was a pleasure, and I wish you the best for this very, very important podcast series.
Thank you.